The enormous fist of the dangerous creature destroyed everything around it with devastating force, turning stone into fine dust. It was a stone golem, fiercely battling the warriors who dared to enter its lair. Even though it was only a low-level dungeon, the guy who rushed forward couldn't even scratch the enemy. Then, the golem moved on to the next night, while another fighter shouted for the guy not to take the blow directly and to lead the enemy away. Gathering their strength, their team finally decided to go on the offensive. One of the guys made a quick dash toward his opponent and attacked him with his sword, which was sharp enough to scratch the monster's tough body. The warriors attacked their enemy from all sides. So, the golem did not have time to defend itself, and only screamed in agony. In fact, this only angered the monster even more, so it awakened new powers within itself. The warriors immediately realized that the golem had entered a state of rage. So, one of them commanded everyone to take up a defensive position and asked the mages to finish off the enemy. Hearing this, the sorcerers immediately grabbed their staffs and began to concentrate energy for their spells. At that moment, one of them turned to the young man who had been standing behind them all this time and asked him to pour mana into him. It was Sano Haruto, nicknamed Manon, who was a level 29 hunter. The guy wasted no time in fulfilling his partner's request to help him in such a difficult battle. In a couple of seconds, he had enough mana in his hands to transfer it to his friend. The mage immediately felt a surge of energy and declared that this should be enough to defeat the great golem. Meanwhile, the golem was no longer holding back and was about to attack their team, but it was too late because the mage had just finished preparing his spell and was now ready to mercilessly finish off his opponent. This devastating blow literally tore the stone golem into small pieces in an instant and finished clearing the dungeon. After all this fighting, the warriors could finally sit down and catch their breath. After such an intense battle, the commander turned to our hero and noted that, as usual, he had been of no help today, so he asked the guy to at least help sort out the loot. The other warriors knew that Sanoho Haruto was a damage dealer, but for some reason, he was always assigned to support, which was very strange. It turned out that San Haruto had terrible skills, so he could only generate mana and nothing else. One of the friends who was discussing the young man behind his back jumped up when he learned about his abilities because he thought it was literally the best skill. Others still thought it was no big deal since mages and healers could also absorb mana. So, he was only needed in boss battles, which is why he hadn't been able to reach level 30 in 5 years. Everyone mockingly discussed how even the weakest hunter would be much stronger than a normal person. Sano Haruto himself was greatly annoyed by the fact that they all spoke loudly on purpose so that he could hear everything, but even that did not make him think about stopping going to the dungeons. The events then moved to the skyscraper where the Taiken Guild headquarters was located. The main character had just learned the shocking news that he, a hunter, had been transferred to the production department. His boss explained that the harsh truth was that no other hunters wanted to take Haruto with them to the dungeon. In addition, the guy was still at level 29, so no one would let him into a solo dungeon, and his only skill was mana generation. Sano Haruto thought this was completely unfair because his mana was useful to many people and he was just a little bit away from level 30. The man emphasized that healers and mages usually have mana absorption skills. So in most raids, the guy would be like a fifth wheel and his level wouldn't change that. The guild simply decided to develop the main character strengths, so he would definitely fit in well in the mana potion production department. Sano Haruto was not at all eager to go there, so he asked if they were going to kick him out of the organization if he refused. In the end, they told him straight up that he wasn't developing at all, and then they kicked him out of the guild in disgrace. The main character couldn't come to terms with the fact that he had lost his job in an instant, and now he wandered aimlessly around the city. In fact, the endless generation and transfer of mana to allies was not the young man's main skill, because he had another ability that he had never told anyone about. The surprising thing was that Haruto had acquired it even before he officially became a hunter. It turned out that the guy could copy anything using his unique skill. All he had to do was press a few buttons in the system window to make everything work. Then the main character held out his hand with the Onajurai and waited for the ability to work. A few seconds later, a perfect duplicate of the snack appeared on his hand. The problem was that after waking up, Sano Haruto realized that this skill was pretty useless for a hunter. At first, he was even thrilled with this ability, but it turned out that only he had access to it. As soon as the object leaves his hands, it disappears like a mirage. So the guy can't copy money or resell the copied equipment. But what annoyed him the most was that there was a level restriction for copying equipment. The main character was called Amanos because of his endless mana generation. But in reality, he was just copying a small amount of absorbed mana. So, Haruto tried to copy skills in the same way. Haruto was incredibly angry about this because if he could level up and copy good equipment, he would finally show everyone what he was capable of. At that moment, he saw breaking news on his smartphone that the long sword of the Kish Dragon was arriving in Japan. This sword had 2 special skill slots and significantly increased defense. And it was also unique because it had its own level and increased the user's level to 200. Haruto immediately thought that such a weapon would be perfect for a hunter. But the problem was that it could only be used from level 30. And besides, the blade had only 10% of its durability left. The main character thought this was a great opportunity for him. So all he had to do was touch the legendary sword, so they could recreate it forever and not pay attention to its durability. A few days later, Haruto went back to the dungeon to prepare for his plan. It was the lair of the Great Spider, an underground lair not registered with the Hunter Association. At that moment, one of the mages turned to the guy and asked him to pour some mana. The main character steadily performed his duties and hoped to find a way to finally reach level 30. Using his copying ability, he quickly replenished the mage's resources. The mage immediately felt a surge of strength and was already preparing to burn every enemy in his path. Haruto had to try hard not to get caught in this attack, which is why he hated dangerous fire mages in enclosed spaces. After clearing the area, our hero immediately went to check his level. At that moment, one of the team members approached him and laughed at the fact that the young man was checking his status again because it was obvious that nothing would change anyway. He hoped that Haruto enjoyed the whole show in the front row and hinted that they should charge the guy for it in that case. It was our hero's guildmate, Ikanaga Aoi, who now demanded a drink from his friend when they were done here to earn money. This friend had been going down into unregistered dungeons since childhood, although they had now entered a rather dangerous dungeon. Thanks to Ikanaga, our hero was able to accompany the high-ranking hunters. The boss arena was very close, so the whole team hurried and soon found themselves at the Great Spider's nest. There, a huge monster awaited them, guarding its eggs and ready to tear apart anyone who dared to approach its future offspring. It was Alexa, the level 80 dungeon boss, who was now sleeping peacefully, unaware of the presence of enemies. The main character began to doubt that this devilish creature could be killed at all, because just the sight of it made his knees buckle. Ikanaga Aoi noticed that his partner was very worried and immediately warned him that no one was going to let him into the fight, so there was nothing to be afraid of. He believed that killing the great spider should be easy, but it was still better to be careful and keep a close eye on the web and eggs. If the spider's offspring were destroyed, she would immediately fly into a rage, which would surely spell the end for all of them. At that moment, the mage turned to Ikanaga, not understanding why he was wasting his time on some mononos. The guy immediately apologized to his partner, who continued to complain that they had no time for all this. After that, the mage immediately ran forward because he couldn't wait to fight and accidentally slipped. One of the stones that flew off his foot landed right in a web that was best left untouched. Everyone watched this scene in horror, realizing that it would not lead to anything good. Finally, the spider awoke from her sleep. Sensing movement nearby, Alexa screamed frantically, warning the hunters that she was definitely not going to spare anyone. One of the warriors immediately rushed to defend his companions and yelled at the mage, who was responsible for waking the dungeon boss at the wrong time. She struck the guy's shield with her huge paw, but he still managed to stay on his feet. Then, he swung his blade harder and cut off the creature's hairy limb. After that, the leader turned to his teammates again and reminded them to beware of the web and eggs. The other members of the cleanup crew took note of this and immediately rushed forward to help their comrade. The spider could do nothing against the nimble and strong hunters who surrounded her on all sides. The main character watched the whole scene with admiration in his eyes and realized that his partners were truly formidable. Alexa understood that she had to do something because otherwise the hunters would soon win. She turned around to release her web. So, the commander immediately ordered everyone to hide behind the columns. The cocky mage didn't understand why everyone was running away because he had defeated similar opponents many times before. He asked everyone to step aside because he was going to burn this monster along with its web. The spider was a quick-witted creature, so she immediately built a shield for herself. Meanwhile, the fireball was already flying towards her at full speed, illuminating the dungeon with orange light. In the end, the sturdy web simply deflected the blow, giving the mage no chance to make amends for his mistake. This only angered the guy even more, so now he was going to show his true power. The main character tried to stop the mage because he understood that he would only make things worse. Their partner was no longer listening to any warnings and was already preparing to unleash a meteor shower. The commander immediately turned to his foolish partner and warned him that he could accidentally hit his balls, which would be a fatal mistake. Haruto froze in horror as he watched the guy's actions. Realizing that it was too late to change anything, the fire fiercely engulfed the unprotected eggs, which began to crack with a loud crunch. The team leader shouted for everyone to run away because the spider would definitely go berserk after that. He didn't manage to hide in time, so Alexa was able to trap him in her web. Oi immediately ran up to Haruto and quickly pulled him behind a column to hide from the enraged monster. Meanwhile, the spider's eyes were literally burning with rage because some strangers dared to destroy her children. The commander was still desperately trying to get out of the web, but all his attempts were futile. The mage was also unable to escape from Alexa, and now couldn't believe that the fireball had really had no effect on her. At that moment, she spotted the culprit responsible for the death of all her offspring with a nervous smile on his face and tears in his eyes. The boy begged the spider not to do what she had planned. In the end, he couldn't hold back and began to shout at the top of his lungs for the monster not to come near him. This did not help the poor fellow at all. So with one movement of her huge paw, Alexa crushed his helpless body. The main character couldn't take his frightened eyes off this scene. It turned out that he also didn't have time to escape from the web, so now he was tightly bound. The spider's paw was very close to him, so there was less and less time left for rescue. Alexa, noticing Haruto, looked straight into the young man's eyes with her terrifying gaze. Previously, our hero thought that this was just a low-level dungeon that he had entered for the sake of one unfortunate level, but now he found himself on the verge of death. At that moment, the spider swung her sharp paw to teach another person who dared to disturb her peace a lesson. A second later, she pierced Haruto through and through, who had no chance of dodging the blow. The main character immediately began to choke on his own blood, suffocating from the unbearable pain. Suddenly, a system message popped up in front of his eyes, asking if he wanted to copy and paste the selected object. Now, it turned out that Haruto's skill wasn't so useless after all. It turned out that the rule of object disappearance did not work on the boy's own body. So, he created a copy of himself just in case. Upon death, his consciousness moved to the copy and the dead body simply disappeared. The main character still found it difficult to get used to his own body disintegrating before his eyes. But he had no other choice now, so he used his backup plan. Haruto's new life did not last long because the spider noticed him and pierced him again with her sharp paw. Then the young man used his ability, which had no limitations, and created a new body. Finally, he was able to hide behind one of the pillars until Alexa could figure out where her next victim had gone. Haruto understood that this creature would not let him go, even if he kept copying himself endlessly. At that moment, our hero noticed that his bound friend was nearby and still alive. The guy immediately closed his eyes and turned away from this horrific scene because he simply did not know how to help his friend. Meanwhile, the spider seemed to sense human presence and was already approaching their shelter. Ikunaga also heard all this, so he desperately tried to shout to the main character to help him. Haruto understood that it would be too difficult to get out of there, but he couldn't abandon his friend either. The boy began to remember that it was this friend who had helped him when everyone else had abandoned him, so he rushed into battle to at least try to help Aoi. He quickly grabbed his not-so-strong sword and tried to strike Alex with his first blow. It was useless, so the spider forcefully threw the main character aside. The monster's paw hit the pole to which Aloy was tied and fortunately did not hit the guy himself. Suddenly, the system announced that the main character's level had been raised, which he certainly did not expect at such a hopeless moment. The main character was surprised that his blow had worked after all, but he did not yet suspect that the spider had attacked him again. In the end, Alexa pierced Haruto, who did not have time to react to such a sudden threat. After copying his body, the guy immediately thought that all he had to do was get to the long sword of the Corrosion Dragon. Although it seemed that it would not be soon, he understood that he would not be able to escape anyway. So, he was going to kill the dungeon boss, even if it meant dying 100 times. Our hero understood that in order to succeed, he needed to inflict at least some damage on the enemy in one of his lives. He spent 3 whole days in this dungeon, fighting day and night, and losing about 50 lives. But during that time, his skills improved significantly. Haruto was already more confidently chopping at the spider's body because her death was only a matter of time. The giant spider was getting weaker by the minute, and fortunately, this monster had no regeneration abilities. Despite this, Alexa continued to fight and release her dangerous web again and again. These attacks were very fast and cunning, so our hero had to try hard not to fall into such a trap. Since the young man had already improved many of his skills, he could easily escape these spider shells, even though there were 4 of them at a time. It turned out that Alexa was simply driving Haruto under her paw, with which she was going to pierce him once again. The guy had even gotten used to such powerful blows, so he was able to jump aside in time. This allowed him to deftly climb onto Alexa's body and get closer to her. Getting close to the spider's head, our hero jumped high and swung his weapon to strike the enemy's weak spot. Haruto shouted belligerently, putting all his rage and pain into the cry as he wanted to finally finish off this monster and end the protracted battle. He struck right between the great spider's eyes, putting the last of his strength into the attack. In the end, the blade simply broke into pieces without landing a blow. Only now did the main character realize that he had forgotten to copy and paste his sword. He couldn't do anything to the enemy, so he fell down with a crash without any weapons in his hands. The spider, now missing one eye, screamed furiously as she tried to catch up with Haruto. The boy knew that he would not be able to escape from the monster, which was approaching him too quickly. Suddenly, Alexa stopped, and the pupils of her terrifying eyes narrowed from sudden pain. Her body began to tear apart from the inside. So now she forgot about her main goal in the form of Haruto. In the end, the monster simply fell apart, splattering blood everywhere. The main character lay on the ground for a while, simply rejoicing that he had finished off this creature, spending his 56 lives. The system reported several times that the hunter's level had been raised after successfully destroying Alexa. In addition, the guy also managed to get a reward for defeating the great spider. After that, our hero immediately rushed to rescue Aoya and asked him to hang on, promising to treat his friend to the best whiskey when they got out of there. Suddenly, Haruto received a strong blow to the side, which knocked him off his feet. With Aoya behind him, he fell to the ground and now tried to figure out who had attacked them. It turned out that the main character's adventure was not over yet because the newborn offspring of the great spider were waiting for him here. The guy knew he could basically handle these enemies. But the problem was that it would be tough to fight while protecting Aoi at the same time. He pulled his friend close, trying to protect him from the spiders that were already closing in on them. Suddenly, someone intervened in their fight and cut one of the spiders in half. The other monsters immediately turned their attention to the one who dared to go against them. They immediately pounced on the girl who had come to the aid of our heroes. The savior was not afraid of such opponents at all because she had enormous powers and now she used hellfire against them. It was the highest spell of fire magic, and there were only a few sorcerers in the whole world who could control it. The main character remembered only one mage in Japan who possessed such an ability. It was a knight mage who used the witch's sword, ranked 5th in the Japanese hunter rankings. After dealing with all the monsters, she turned to Haruto and asked if they were the only survivors here. The boy carrying his friend on his shoulders replied that unfortunately that was indeed the case. The knight looked around and concluded that all the eggs had been broken, which was why the spider had gone berserk. She concluded that the Heil group had been completely destroyed, so her gaze immediately returned to the main character. The girl was surprised that this young man had been able to defeat the dungeon boss and even save his companion because it was obvious that he was just a low-level hunter. The events then moved to the headquarters of the Japan Hunters Association. The main character was immediately sent to the interrogation room to find out all the details of the incident. Haruto kept saying that they were very grateful to the hunter Nanis and the dungeon manager for saving them. The girl herself did not attach any particular significance to this event because she believed that she was simply doing her job. She also said that all the items and reports about the giant spider had already been handed over. Nas finally allowed the main character to leave because he had provided them with all the necessary information. Haruto did not expect them to be released so easily after a group of high-level adventurers bought their way into an unregistered dungeon and died there almost to the last man. The girl then explained that dozens, even hundreds of travelers die every day in unregistered dungeons because they themselves sign a declaration of consent to this risk when entering and exiting. She also decided to tell him about the low-level hunters, which our hero was one of. These people pay bribes for illegal participation in dungeons in order to level up. So, the association simply turns a blind eye to this. The girl emphasized that the desire to become stronger is natural for any hunter, even if it is illegal, and asked if the young man had any more questions. Haruto replied that she had explained everything clearly and thanked her again for all her help. Before he left, Nannies also warned him that payment for the items he had provided to the big spider would arrive in a few days. In turn, the main character refused his reward and asked that the entire amount be given to Ioi. For a while, the girl just stared at the doorway, where Haruto was no longer standing. She began to suspect that this young man was clearly not an ordinary person since he had refused the reward. Be that as it may, clearing a high-level dungeon alone was almost impossible. So Nanis was literally convinced that the hunter Sono was definitely hiding something. Meanwhile, Haruto couldn't help but smile because everything was going better than he could have imagined. He opened his inventory to look at the great spider's rods, which he had been able to copy using his skill. This item had the same effect as a spider web, and when used exhibited strong adhesive properties for a certain period of time. In fact, the guy was disappointed when he read its description because it sounded like it was just ordinary glue which had cost so much effort and lives. In any case, he decided to copy the rod so that he could at least use it as sticky tape against flies and mosquitoes. The main character also had no idea how to use this item, so he decided to study it. A second later, the rod simply dissolved into thin air. So Haruto didn't even have time to understand anything. The young man began to look around in confusion, not understanding where the rod had disappeared to. It turned out that it had been absorbed by an existing skill and increased the insertion ability, which shocked our hero, as he had no idea that such a thing was possible. Then the system announced that the copying skill could be further improved. As for insertion, he had now reached a new level. So there were now 3 variants of the skill. Now Haruto knew that skills could evolve if they absorbed the corresponding item. After that, the young man wanted to see what it said about the new options. It turned out that inserted objects could now be held for as long as desired, as well as inserted anywhere for a certain amount of time. Haruto had previously thought that this skill was completely useless, but now everything was completely different. He decided to try out the new features right away and inserted the rod for just 1 minute. The main character watched with a smirk as he released the object from his hands, and it finally did not disappear. When the time was up, the great spider's rod dissolved into thin air and disappeared. Haruto's eyes immediately lit up with wild excitement because this news changed all the rules of the game. In that case, he decided to make more items and set their timers to 101,000 years. Haruto still couldn't contain his emotions from all this news, so he rejoiced right in the middle of the office. The guy was sure that from this day on he would finally become rich and be able to live like a human being. But first of all, he needed to copy the sword of the Corrisian dragon. Meanwhile, the events returned 2 hours earlier to the Rainbow Bridge in Tokyo. The traffic was very heavy here, and endless streams of cars were rushing in different directions at tremendous speeds. A convoy was driving here, and their lead car had to maintain speed and distance. In one of the cars sat Moore Grant from the International Hunters Association, who asked his partner how many times she had been to Japan. Aries Hugh, who also belonged to his organization, replied briefly that she had been here twice before. The guy remembered that the girl's mother seemed to be from these lands, so she probably enjoyed coming back here. She coldly noted that it was his mother's homeland, but not hers, so it didn't really matter. Moore Grant also reminded her that the longsword exhibition would also end in Japan and asked if his partner had applied for leave. The girl confirmed this and said that she wanted to find something in the Japanese dungeons, so the hunter simply wished her luck in her search. She also said something strange about it not being his business, but warned that one day it would affect him, too. At that moment, the lead vehicle was informed via radio that they were passing through the underground passage on Rainbow Bridge. Due to electromagnetic waves underground, communication was interrupted for 5 minutes. Moore Grant was surprised to see that the dungeon was located directly above the sea, but he thought it was even a little romantic. The girl was not so carefree about all this, so she asked her companion not to talk nonsense, because if the underground collapsed, it would be a real disaster. Her partner immediately shouted for someone to open the window in the car, because there was a real, stifling smell. But Aries Hugh still didn't understand what was romantic about a dangerous dungeon. Now the events moved to the office at the entrance to the underground on Rainbow Bridge. Ticket seller Chino Satoru stood and complained that he was bored working as a ticket seller at the entrance, while his partner couldn't understand why the guy was upset when he was still lucky. Looking at the dungeon, he said that just 3 weeks ago it had been a real hell on earth. At that moment, a strange large drop landed near the young man's foot. At first, the guys couldn't understand what it was, looking at the strange substance in confusion. Then the ticket seller took a closer look and realized that it was a cute slug that had somehow ended up outside the dungeon. Picking up the creature, he turned to Satoru and asked if the slug could have appeared on the surface. The hunter was frightened when he saw this phenomenon because he understood perfectly well where it would lead. Meanwhile, a monster much larger than a slug had already appeared behind him. With fear, Satoru looked up at the monster that had emerged from the dungeon. Realizing that the situation was completely out of control, the guys immediately grabbed their weapons, hoping that this would somehow protect them from such a giant. The huge orc attacked them with his spike club while the hunter desperately tried to defend himself with his weak shield. Then the events returned to the present day in the office of the Japan Hunters Association. The main character just saw that all his stats had increased and his level had risen to 50, so he hadn't died so many times in vain. When a hunter reaches this level, it is easier for him to join a group because usually in mid-level dungeons, monsters are about the same level with the exception of areas for beginners. To start with, Haruta was going to collect great spider rods to try to sell them at auction. At that moment, he heard heavy footsteps behind him, echoing hollowly in the silence of the corridor. They were hunters who looked quite agitated and were rushing somewhere. So, they asked everyone to step aside. Then the main character heard them talking about how some kind of dungeon had just collapsed. The guy, like them, couldn't understand how this could have happened and began to suspect that a breakthrough had occurred somewhere. Meanwhile, the hunters were talking among themselves about how they had been sent there before some large guilds because the wagon with the legendary sword had also fallen into the trap, which is why they had received the request. Only now did Haruto realize that the long sword of the Carishan dragon was surrounded by monsters from a breach. Helicopters were already waiting on the roof of the Hunter Association building to transport the hunters to the breach site. They were already preparing to request assistance from other guilds as their primary task was to protect the van with the legendary items. One of the hunters thought this was complete nonsense and asked who had given the order. But then his partner intervened, emphasizing that he was the commander of their squad. It was Nannies who ordered her subordinates to destroy the monsters and protect the civilians, which was their top priority. She looked sternly at the hunters and emphasized once again that the situation was an emergency. So all questions should be left for later. At that moment, the girl noticed that something strange was also happening on the roof. In the distance, security guards were trying to detain a guy who was trying to break through them and also fly on this mission. Nannies tried to get everyone into the helicopter as quickly as possible because they definitely didn't have any time to spare. The guards still weren't going to let the young man go, so he tried to shout to the commander and tell him that he also wanted to help. Suddenly, the girl realized that this was the same Mr. Sano they had spoken to just a moment ago. He wanted to help evacuate civilians if he couldn't fight the monsters, noting that any help would be useful in such a situation. Naz did not expect the young man to want to join them, so she did not even know how to respond to his offer. In the end, the entire team went to help at the site of the dungeon breach. The commander praised Haruto for saving his comrade in the Great Spider's dungeon, and now he had decided to help evacuate civilians. The main character responded to all this with only a forced smile because he knew perfectly well that he was only pursuing his own goals. Meanwhile, the others couldn't understand why all this was happening. Because it had only been 3 weeks since the Rainbow Bridge breach had been closed, the commander explained that anything could happen in their world, including another underground breach. And no matter how many times it happened, they would go to the epicenter every time to prevent a repeat of the disaster that had occurred 15 years ago. Silence immediately fell among the hunters because they understood what Nannis was talking about. Out of anger, the main character clenched his fists because he remembered these events as if it were yesterday. At that time, there were simultaneous breakthroughs of dungeons around the world, causing an international disaster. If the monsters in the dungeon are not exterminated in sufficient numbers, the dungeon becomes overcrowded and collapses, forming a breach, and then they break out, attacking peaceful residents. It was in this chaos that young Haruto's parents died, becoming innocent victims. Haruto had never told anyone about this before, and no one would have believed him. But at that moment, a supernatural creature from another dimension appeared. It was this creature that bestowed upon the main character what he thought was a curse. The creature called it a gift and set a time limit of 20 years, but the boy did not know whether this meant the duration of the ability or his life. The hourglass of the curse continued to run even now, which made Haruto a little nervous. In addition, the young man was afraid that it might happen again because that creature had appeared after a great catastrophe. The main character understood that when it appeared again, another cataclysm would occur, so there were only 5 years left. In any case, Haruto hoped that he would be able to prevent the catastrophe and lift the curse because now he understood how to develop his abilities and become the strongest hunter. Meanwhile, complete chaos reigned on Rainbow Bridge with powerful explosions. Monsters attacked civilians and destroyed everything around them, turning the once bustling bridge into ruins. Crumpled cars flew in different directions under the powerful blows of the monsters. There were still too few hunters, so the ticket seller feared that they would simply not be able to protect all the civilians. At that moment, a huge ogre tried to attack the young man from behind, raising his massive club for a crushing blow. At the last second, he managed to react to the attack, cutting the monster in half. Then the next ogre tried again to strike the ticket collector, who had not yet recovered from the previous monster. But it wasn't that simple, because his partner came to his aid in time, throwing his sword at the monster. The hunter shouted at the young man not to count crows when they were in the thick of battle. Satoru looked at him in surprise and, barely catching his breath from the shock, sincerely thanked him for saving him. The hunter was angry that the young man dared to relax at such a crucial moment. So, he advised him not to relax in the middle of the battlefield. The guy had already noticed that his partner didn't mince words, but it was the older man who had saved him from the orc, and today was the second time he had come to his rescue. The ticket seller looked admiringly at Satoru, who had lost too much blood and looked unwell and was about to repay his debt. Then he decided to ask if there was any news about reinforcements. But because of the electromagnetic waves in the dungeon, they couldn't contact them. In any case, the hunter was sure that the others were already aware of the situation and were on their way here. He emphasized that they should also run to the bridge to meet the reinforcements as quickly as possible. At that moment, a new monster suddenly appeared on the bridge among the wrecked cars. It was the Bear King, who possessed a monstrous level 190. Moore wasn't entirely sure that their van would be okay, but Ares asked him not to worry because the protective magic was working at its highest level. His partner was sure that even a level 400 monster wouldn't be able to scratch their vehicle. Meanwhile, the bridge began to slowly collapse, causing pieces of concrete and rebar to fall into the water. A second monster appeared a moment later, causing the girl to suspect that even the strongest magic would not protect them. Satoru and his partner were so shocked that they couldn't say a word when they saw this creature. At that moment, a growing rumble sounded nearby, and Nanny's team finally arrived. The pilot immediately tried to inform the commander about what was happening on the bridge, but he couldn't find the words to describe it all. Even Nanny's herself became agitated when she saw what awaited them ahead. Right in the epicenter of all the destruction appeared the boss of the Rainbow Bridge dungeon, Kasha. Finally, the commander regained her composure and ordered the entire squad to prepare for the attack. At that very moment, the huge dragon began to concentrate its power in its mouth to strike them. Its power was so immense that it seemed as if the very space around it was bending and cracking at the seams. Kasha breathed furiously and watched intently with his heavy gaze to see if his projectile had reached its target. Seeing this, the main character couldn't believe that this creature had destroyed an entire bridge and hoped that his long sword was intact. Meanwhile, the pilots had to try to maneuver somehow to save their lives and the lives of their teammates. In the end, they were unable to dodge the blow, and a powerful explosion rocked the bridge. Nannies immediately ordered everyone to listen to her carefully and announced that they were changing the plan, and now everyone had to focus on destroying the Kishi. The other hunters also managed to jump out of the helicopter successfully, so now they were ready to carry out any orders. At that moment, Nannis noticed that Mr. Sano had disappeared somewhere. But in any case, she was sure that he was fine. The girl had a feeling that this man simply could not die so easily. So for now, she decided to focus on more serious problems. Without hesitation, she decided to use Hellfire against the dungeon boss. Haruto, who had landed safely with the help of the Great Spider's Web, was watching all this from the sidelines and now thought about copying the skill a little later. But he decided not to get distracted by this because now he had a completely different main task. The guy wanted to find and copy the long sword of the Kurisai dragon as quickly as possible. At the same time, new reinforcements arrived at the bridge, fearing that they too would be in danger if they made one wrong move. It turned out that they were going to take advantage of all this chaos because the hunter Nana and the others would be busy for a while, and they would be able to take the long sword of the Kurisai dragon. The bandit squad leader ordered them to move quietly so as not to run into any monsters. Haruto also slowly advanced toward his goal and saw that there were many dead monsters lying around, which was obviously the work of the hunters. But the young man still had a bad feeling because he knew very well that these creatures usually acted in packs. At that moment, he heard someone nearby, fighting and shouting. It was Satoru Sonoda, whose partner was yelling at him to run away. But the guy wasn't going to do that because he could still handle monsters like these. The hunter was already too badly wounded to continue fighting or running away. So he asked his partner to leave, otherwise they would both be doomed. Our hero immediately realized that these were the hunters who controlled the entrance to the dungeon. Haruto understood that he must not be distracted from his main task. So he decided that these guys would have to deal with their problems themselves somehow. Meanwhile, the hunters started yelling at the young man because he didn't understand that when these low-level dogs gather in packs, they are equal to a Heil monster. The sound of claws scraping against the asphalt grew louder, and the monsters themselves were getting closer and closer to the Doom Boys. The hunter emphasized that the fact that they had seen only one wolf meant that there were many more somewhere nearby. The ticket seller saw this huge crowd of enemies, but he no longer cared about his own life. The young man understood that his companion had received all these wounds only because of him, so he simply could not abandon his partner to be eaten by the wolves. The main character stopped immediately when he heard the words of one of the hunters. Memories immediately came to his mind of how he had recently tried to save Aoya from the dungeon. The wolves surrounded the hunters on all sides and were just waiting for the right moment to pounce on them all at once. In the end, one of the monsters jumped right at the ticket seller, who was momentarily confused. The young man was not so weak after all, so he was able to give the monster a decent fight. But it wasn't that simple, because at that very moment, another creature tried to attack him from behind. The ticket inspector had to put his arm out to block the blow so that the clawed paw would not hit his body. After that, he plunged his sword straight into the wolf's neck, once again defeating his opponent. While the guy was pulling his sword out of the predator's body, another monster from the pack pounced on him. Only at the last moment did the ticket seller realize that a rabid monster was flying at him. The main character intervened in time, throwing the creature away from the confused young man with his whole body. The force of the blow was so great that the wolf could not resist and only whimpered pitifully. Then Haruto turned to the young man he had just saved and asked if he was all right. The ticket seller replied that he was fine, but his fear and panic did not go away. He was incredibly frightened because he saw that there was still a huge number of monsters ahead. The young man thanked our hero for his help, but asked him to run away quickly because even Heil hunters would not be able to cope with such a huge pack. Haruto was not afraid of this fact at all, so a mischievous grin immediately appeared on his face. The ticket seller certainly did not expect such a reaction, because in such a situation, it is unlikely that anyone would have positive emotions. The main character immediately rummaged through his inventory and thought that he would probably have to put his items up for auction a little later. Meanwhile, the monstrous wolves with their terrifying howls had already rushed forward bearing their sharp fangs. The creatures were already very close to Haruto, who paid no attention to them and thought about combining the great spider's rod with his skill. He had always wondered how effective it would be against a large group of monsters. The young man was seriously frightened when he saw what the main character had in mind. Haruto himself decided to use the great spider's rod together with the second version of the insert skill. So now all the monsters were wrapped in cobwebs. The young man's smile grew even wider because he had successfully put his plan into action. All the monsters fell helplessly to the ground and were now unable to attack our heroes. Haruto wrapped them all in a huge cocoon using the great spider's strong web. After that, the main character noticed that simply tying them up did not give him much of a level boost. But as expected, the technique worked perfectly against the pack. Meanwhile, the young man was simply shocked by what he saw and was no longer sure that it was just a normal skill and not something high level. Finally, Satoru thanked Haruto for his help and asked if he was the reinforcement from the association. So, our hero had to confirm this since they had flown in on the same helicopter anyway. Then, catching his breath, the wounded hunter asked the guy to take his young partner with him. The ticket seller immediately jumped on him and started shouting that he would not abandon his savior, even at the cost of his own life. The main character, who was watching this drama from the sidelines, was surprised by such strong loyalty. He sighed heavily because he understood that in this situation, both of them were in danger and they had no other choice. Haruto couldn't just leave these hunters here, so he opened his inventory and handed Satoru a potion. The wounded man was surprised when he saw the bottle because he knew very well that it was a mid-level potion. The hunter was shocked by the young man's decision, so he asked why he was giving him such a valuable item. Haruto smiled and explained that without help, the young man simply wouldn't make it home, so he needed a reliable partner by his side. The ticket collector himself looked admiringly at our hero, who had so nobly saved them both. Satoru thanked the guy for his help and asked him to remember his name so that he could repay him for everything in the future. Haruto was about to move on to fulfill his main task, but suddenly stopped. It turned out that he had topographical cretinism, so he asked the guys to tell him where the International Hunters Association van was. The young man was surprised by such a simple question because he certainly did not expect to meet a hunter who did not know how to navigate. At the same time, on the other side of the Rainbow Bridge, a huge bear was rampaging. Aries Hugh skillfully applied her skills, and the monster immediately fell to the ground powerless. Her partner was surprised to see that even though she was a hunter, the girl was a pacifist. So, she simply put her opponent to sleep. At that moment, somewhere nearby, an incredibly fast projectile flew through the air with a deafening whistle. Grant immediately reacted to this threat, demonstrating his quick reflexes. With one sharp movement, he cut the projectile in half in mid-flight with his blade. In fact, the hunter had sensed from the very beginning that someone would take advantage of the chaos to steal the sword. He wasn't afraid at all, because these people were far from the first to think of this before. Meanwhile, Aries Hugh tensed up, realizing who they were dealing with. The bandit leader was impressed by their insight, and now wanted to see what they were capable of. He didn't wait any longer and rushed forward to attack the long sword guards. The first bandit attacked Grant, who masterfully blocked the lightning-fast strike with his sword. With a smirk on his face, the hunter noted that it was better not to underestimate them, the escorts of the legendary weapon. With steely confidence, he asked his enemies not to think that they could be dealt with so easily. After that, the opponents tried to retreat, so more immediately rushed in pursuit. Ares tried to stop her companion because it was too risky. A few seconds later, the hunter felt incredible pain, which immediately forced him to stop. Despite all his former confidence and threatening words, he had reached his limit and fell to his knees, exhausted, and began to bleed. The girl immediately ran to the guy before he could understand what had happened to him, because no one had directly attacked him. Then, Ares explained that their opponents had sprayed a poison that caused damage and blocked mana absorption for a while. So if Moore continued to fight, it would kill him. Now, the bandit realized that she was a mage and seemed to have pretty good intuition, and also noted that this was their usual way of working. Ares couldn't believe that someone could so casually talk about using poison against people, despite the association's ban. In the end, she decided to use her skills and make her enemies regret what they had done 100,000 times over. The bandits only laughed at the idea that a mage incapable of using mana could do such a thing. In just a moment, one of them lost his head, so the other fighters immediately forgot about the enemy and looked at their partner in fear. A huge bear also approached them, which was definitely more dangerous than the guards of the legendary weapon. Without wasting any time, the Bear King pounced on the group of confused bandits. He growled menacingly, warning everyone around him of his intentions and radiating the most terrifying aura possible. In the end, the monster simply turned all the bandits into a bloody mess before they could even resist such power. The enraged beast scattered the lifeless bodies of the robbers in all directions with powerful blows of his paws. He mercilessly crushed them, depriving them of any hope of salvation in this bloody massacre. Only one commander managed to escape, shouting curses at Ari, who was clearly behind it all. Only now did he suddenly realize that all this time the dangerous predator was not dead at all, but was merely in a deep sleep. In the end, the leader of the bandits decided to retreat because the entire team had been destroyed in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, the Bear King was now going to attack Moore and Ares, who were also unable to defend themselves. Then the guy asked if his partner could put him to sleep again. The girl immediately reminded him that she couldn't absorb mana at all, and Moore laughed that his bet on her pacifism had paid off. She only agreed with her partner's words, but understood that he was not obliged to die because of her. Ares wasted no more time and prepared to defend her comrade from the monster. The mage put all her strength into the spell to hold back the Bear King. The wounded Moore was frightened when he saw what she was about to do, so he desperately tried to stop his partner. Ignoring all warnings, the girl rushed at full speed toward the monster. Soon, Ares began to choke on blood due to the effects of the poison, which had not yet dissipated from the area. Despite the incredible pain, she continued to hold her spell for the sake of her friend's safety. The girl now understood that the block on mana absorption completely blocked her own abilities as well. Seeing the Bear King's huge paw flying towards her at breakneck speed, Ares simply accepted her fate. At that moment, the main character came to her aid and tried to save her with his ability. The shocked girl froze in complete stupor because she did not expect something like this to be possible at all. Out of nowhere, streams of web appeared, heading towards the dungeon boss. They began to bind the bear's paws, which now could not reach its final goal. In the end, the web completely bound the monster, depriving it of the ability to resist. But that was still not enough. So Haruto released a huge number of great spider cocoons. In an instant, the furious monster was completely immobilized by the sticky thread and turned into a motionless bundle. Then the main character approached the defeated monster to see the results of his work. Satoru was impressed by Haruto's work, although the guy himself was not entirely sure that he would be able to catch the Bear King in this way. After what he saw, the young man began to call our hero Senpai, despite the fact that they were actually the same age. There was absolute devotion in Satoru and LT, Unk and GT, SI's because he and Sakabe had saved his life. So now he had to respect and honor them both. Meanwhile, the main character turned to the sword escorts and asked if they were okay. Ares was so shocked that her life had been saved that she didn't even know how to respond to her savior. Her partner, on the other hand, was hostile because he thought their team had also come for the sword. Haruto immediately tried to calm Mura down and explained that they had come to help protect the legendary weapon. The hunter explained that they had recently been attacked by a group of robbers, so he asked why they should trust another group of strangers. Now, the main character understood that the situation here was indeed tense. He concluded that all these corpses belonged to bandits who had come for the long sword, but had been killed by the Bear King. The guy started to get a little worried because he didn't know what to do now. For his part, Morant looked as if he was about to attack Haruto's team. Satoru was incredibly angry that they were treating their savior so unscrupulously, so he showed his pass, confirming that they belonged to the Japanese Association. The main character was glad that the young man had stepped in at the right moment and possibly saved their lives. A broad smile immediately spread across Haruto's face. Because the matter was almost settled, he quickly found several bottles of restorative potion in his inventory to give to Eris and Muru and finally win their trust. The young man was going to do absolutely everything to get the sword of the Corrisian dragon. So, he knew that this investment would pay off handsomely. The escorts were still wary because they couldn't understand where this guy's generosity came from. Ares was a little confused because it all seemed strange. She looked apprehensively at the immobilized Bear King, who was lying almost at her feet. The roar of powerful propellers broke the silence, and helicopters appeared in the sky above the heroes' heads with reinforcements. Sakub immediately guessed that the cavalry had finally arrived, and Satoru was glad that they would finally be rescued. Despite this, the hunter felt an inexplicable anxiety and suspected something was wrong. He began to suspect that the people who had arrived in the helicopters were pursuing their own secret goals. Meanwhile, Nanis, who was at the very center of the battle, ordered everyone to stop attacking because Kasha had entered the third phase and would now strike in all directions. The support guild had already arrived, so the girl was going to buy some time until the evacuation of civilians was complete. At that moment, someone turned to the commander and asked if she really thought this would stop the dungeon's breakthrough. Nanny's was familiar with that voice, so she immediately understood who was addressing her. It was Shirosaki Masadu, a level 5003 dark mage who was also the head of the Guild of the Future. The girl was a little taken back by such a sudden encounter and asked what her acquaintance was doing here. With a cheeky grin on his face, the hunter asked what the question meant. Seeing the mage's actions, Nanny suspected what he was about to do, which frightened her even more. But Masadu had already created a huge magical seal around Koyashi. The girl desperately tried to stop her partner because it was obvious that everything would get even worse if he failed to defeat the monster with this spell. The hunter himself believed that worrying about such trifles would not achieve anything and reminded her of how they had sealed the dungeon on Rainbow Bridge last time. That time, Ms. Nice and the association did almost everything on their own. So this time, he wasn't going to stand aside. In the end, Masadu used dark lightning against the dragon. So the commander shouted for everyone to run away from there quickly. The other hunters managed to react at the last moment to the force that was breaking the ground beneath their feet. At that moment, Kasha finally lost consciousness and collapsed onto the Rainbow Bridge. Thus, the bridge was split into two parts with a wide chasm between them. Only a few managed to grab hold of the debris and hang on to the very edge of the rift. The main character also managed to save himself by once again using the great spider's cocoons. Then, with his heart in his mouth, he turned to the edge of the gaping abyss to assess the scale of the damage. It turns out that Haruto also used the web to save all his friends. He also managed to save the all-important truck carrying the legendary sword. At that moment, the young man heard some strange sounds behind him and immediately turned around to see what was there. Right there was the huge, dangerous mouth of Koyashi, who had not yet tried to kill him. The main character was about to scream in fear, but immediately covered his mouth with his hands so as not to wake the monster. Masadu also came down here and was surprised that someone else had survived such an ordeal. He was sure that Haruto was a low-level hunter, so he praised him for such a trick. Looking closely, our hero noticed a symbol on the mage's clothes that he had seen somewhere before and remembered that it was the third most powerful guild in the country. The main character understood that they belonged to the support team. So he asked why Masadu wasn't busy rescuing citizens and destroying monsters, which should be his priority. It seemed that such things did not interest this Heil magician at all, who thought only of personal gain. Masadu indifferently noted that it seemed like all the citizens had already been evacuated, but he also heard some kind of monster besides Koyashi. Then he noticed that the Bear King, who was still sitting in his cocoon, was still alive. The guy touched the material our hero had used with interest and noted that he had never even thought that the great spider's web could be used in such a way. With a single flick of his wrist, Masadu cut through all those strong threads. In this way, he tore the monster itself to pieces, which could do nothing about it, because it was bound by the web. Haruto was simply shocked when he saw that this man, with a snap of his fingers, tore apart the web that had been able to hold the monster in the huge van and turned the bear into mincemeat. The main character began to suspect that Kasha was also the Workum Sato. But at that moment, a system notification appeared in front of him about his level increase. In addition, the guy was warned that he had failed to obtain an item for defeating the Bear King. Masadu also heard the level up sound from Haruto and was surprised that he was able to get something for that weak monster. He realized that he seemed to have stolen the reward from our hero when he accidentally delivered the final blow. In the end, the mage gave the young man the bear's claws because he didn't need the material at all. The main character had been glaring at him the whole time because he did not appreciate such treatment. Haruto was about to address the insolent mage in his stern voice, but someone interrupted him. It was Mrs. Nannies, who was very concerned about the boy's condition, so she immediately jumped back. She just sighed heavily when she saw what her old acquaintance was doing here. Now, Masadu understood that our hero also belonged to the association, which was the reason why he didn't like him at first. The girl decided to ask what had happened while she was away, but Haruto only hissed through his teeth that nothing special had happened. The commander explained that the support team was currently evacuating civilians and suggested that the young man go with them, because if Kasha woke up, he would start rampaging again. The main character immediately asked if there was any chance of killing this dungeon boss, but Nana sadly replied that it was impossible. When monster boss's health falls below a third, they activate rage or an AoE attack, and in both cases, they attack in different directions. Monsters of the quasi level have a very large amount of health and activate two abilities at the same time, so their battle is divided into phases. And in the third phase, quasi carries out large-scale destructive attacks. The dragon was currently in this phase and was protecting itself with a barrier, absorbing mana from the surrounding environment, so any attacks were useless at this time. A second later, Ki suddenly opened his terrifying eyes and looked at the hunters standing nearby. Nace immediately tensed up because the monster woke up earlier than they had expected. Masadu, on the other hand, thought it was just in time because he was going to turn the boss into a pile of loot before it started unleashing massive attacks. Meanwhile, the girl turned to our hero and suggested that he would be able to get out alive this time, too. The mage, however, believed that such a weakling would definitely not be able to do so because the mortality rate of low-ranking hunters is higher than that of traffic accidents. In the end, he and Nannies rushed forward to destroy Ki. Haruto wasn't going to stand aside either, so he clenched the Bear King's claw tightly in his hands. He had no intention of doing so, but now he wanted to try to kill the dragon first. The main character was very angry at Shiosaki Masato's behavior, which was clearly going too far. To begin with, he decided to lift all his comrades onto the bridge, and Satoru couldn't stop admiring the fact that Haruto had saved his life again. Ares remained as taciturn as ever and looked with interest at the web that had managed to hold them all. Then the main character turned to her and Mu and said that he had a request for them because Kasha had already entered the third phase and would soon begin to rage. He told everyone that with the monster's powerful AoE attacks, there would be nothing left standing. And in such a situation, it would be difficult to find the van and the legendary longsword. With confidence in his voice, Haruto declared that he needed to kill Kisha. But to do so, he needed the long sword of the Karisi dragon. The main character promised that he would return the weapon after victory. So, the convoy immediately began to think. Moore couldn't believe that the young man really had enough strength to defeat an entire dragon, and he wasn't going to believe him despite all the help he had given him. The boy began to worry more because at this rate, the sword would be lost to him forever. Ares explained that this was impossible because removing the seal from the wagon required a huge amount of mana, and the robbers' poison prevented them from absorbing it. Her partner was surprised when he heard the explanation because it was obvious that the girl was not against helping our hero. Then Haruto asked why they hadn't mentioned earlier that this was the only problem. With a smile on his face, the guy explained that he was a mana bearer and could generate mana endlessly. Suddenly, Ares felt a huge surge of energy and was immediately able to use her spells. In a couple of seconds, she already had enough strength to unlock the truck with weapons. The main character immediately jumped down to get the coveted long sword and promised once again to fulfill his promise. Moore still couldn't understand why Ares did this because they couldn't know if this guy was up to something bad. The girl herself believed that everything was fine because the young man had recently tied up the Bear King, but did not kill him, which was in line with her principles. Meanwhile, Haruto was already near the truck and quickly made his way inside. He simply couldn't contain his joy because the long sword of the Karen dragon was almost in his hands. At that moment, the bandit leader suddenly appeared behind the young man. He thought the operation had almost failed, but he decided to watch from a distance to see how it would end. A moment later, the bandit drew his sword and was about to stab the confused Haruto. The main character did not have time to react to the danger, so the sharp sword pierced his body. Satoru and Masadu were shocked when they saw what had happened to their friend. Moore and Eris also did not expect things to turn out this way. The bandit, who was still unaware of our hero's abilities, quickly made his way inside. Before, he couldn't even imagine that he would get the sword in this way. It turned out that the death of its owner caused the great spider's web to break, so the bandit felt a sharp jerk downward. A moment later, the heavy van broke away from the edge of the cliff and crashed into the raging sea waves, dragging the criminal locked inside with it. Water instantly filled the interior, and the heavy van began to rapidly sink to the dark bottom. At that moment, the main character used his abilities and found himself behind his opponent, noting with a smirk that he himself did not think he would get to the sword this way. The bandit did not have time to react to such a sudden turn of events, so the main character was able to stab him with his sword without any problems. Haruto emphasized that he returns all the good and evil that people do to him twofold. After that, he threw the robber away from him so that his body would drown in the bottomless sea. Now the main character finally had the long sword in his hands which he had been chasing for so long, spending so much energy. He gazed with admiration at the sword of the Corrisian dragon, which he had dreamed about so much. Without hesitation, the guy immediately tried to copy this weapon into his inventory. At that moment, the system reported that copying was impossible because the user's level did not match the required level of the object. Haruto certainly did not expect something like this to happen because he was confident in his reliable plan until the very end. He knew for sure that to use the long sword, you needed to be at least level 30, and his own level had long since exceeded 50. Suddenly, the young man heard the voice of the bandit behind him, who seemed to have survived after all. The bandit noted that there was nothing personal in his actions, but the honor of the Blood Tower Guild's assassin was at stake. He stabbed Haruto again with his sword, and Haruto immediately collapsed to the floor, exhausted. It turned out that the bandit had healing skills, which prevented him from dying from the first blow. Now he was going to return the main character's arrogant, self-confident words to him. The bandit emphasized that he quickly forgets kindness, but he returns insults threefold. He made sure that Haruto would die by his blade and never see the dawn again. The main character had already given up and began to remember how hard it had been to get here, only to fail the whole operation in the end. At that moment, the system announced that the long sword of the Corrisian dragon had merged with the user. So now the guy could absorb the weapon's characteristics. Haruto was not yet aware of such possibilities of his ability, so he watched all this with surprise. Thus, the guy was able to gain an additional 35% defense from the long sword's passive skill. The ability also copied and absorbed the blade's first unique skill called vampirism. Next, the main character was able to obtain the second unique skill, which turned out to be Berserk. In the end, Haruto absorbed all the abilities of the legendary weapon until his health level dropped below 25%. For this reason, the Corrisian Dragon Long Sword user's defense mode was activated. Using the copy ability, he earned a second unique sword skill, Berserk. Meanwhile, Ka was already concentrating a huge amount of energy in his mouth to attack. Finally, Masadu realized that things were bad because now the monster was going to hit the area. Precious time was running out, and the air was literally filled with tension from the colossal energy the monster had accumulated for its devastating blow. Suddenly, the huge lizard froze, and the energy accumulated in its mouth began to flicker unsteadily. In an instant, an invisible blade cut Keishu in half, who didn't even have time to scream. Nanis and Masadu watched all this with incredible surprise because they couldn't understand who was behind something so powerful. Finally, the system informed all hunters that the dungeon boss had been successfully destroyed and the breach sealed. Evening came, and the events moved to the building of the Japan Hunters Association. At the meeting, it was reported that as a result of the Rainbow Bridge dungeon breach, many civilians and hunters have been injured and irreparable damage had been done. However, thanks to the prompt actions of the Hunters Association and the guilds, the situation stabilized within 2 hours. Fukuwa Toko addressed his teammates and asked them not to look so sad because this time they had finally managed to defeat Kasha. Takuchi Class, head of the Midas Guild, noted that he had heard that 3 months ago, the association had already sealed the Rainbow Bridge dungeon breach. Shinato Makoto from Taiken immediately explained that sealing it did not guarantee that the dungeon would not collapse again. The others were outraged because they couldn't understand how the dungeon had to be monitored to prevent the breach from recurring in such a short period of time. Nanas, who listened indifferently to all these arguments about ownership of the dungeon, thought only about whether Mr. Sano had managed to escape from there. At that moment, Takuchi Gokas slammed his fist on the table because he wasn't interested in any of this talk. He reminded everyone that it usually takes at least 6 months for a boss to revive. The hunter hinted that this could mean that Ms. Nannies had not finished off Keisha last time. In response, the girl just sighed discontentedly and did not seem to be going to justify herself to her colleague. She calmly and gently placed her hand on the table near the glass. A second later, the entire table began to shake, seriously frightening the other workers. In the end, The furniture shattered into small pieces when Nanis used her powers. In this way, she demonstrated her severity to everyone, forcing the hunters to hide so as not to be hit. Masadu didn't pay much attention to his colleague's sudden gesture and calmly sipped his water, protecting himself with a shield. His coworkers were unhappy with what the girl was doing and asked what the whole charade was about. This action angered Glass even more, causing his anger to flare up with renewed vigor. At that moment, someone finally stopped Mr. Takuchi because it was obvious that this would not lead to anything good. It was Fukuwa Takuo who apologized for their employees' disrespectful behavior. The man just clicked his tongue in dissatisfaction because the girl had completely lost her fear and promised that she would simply die if she continued to provoke him. Nice did not respond to these words and only grunted in reply. The hunter finally explained that she had just shown Shockwave, the reward for the past murder of Ki. Then she turned to Mr. Shiroki, who had contributed the most to their recent confrontation, and emphasized that he would not let her lie. The guy was not happy that his colleague had decided to drag him into this, and agreed that she was not lying, although he'd been too busy lately and had not yet had time to check the reward. Fukuwa Tuo immediately lit up because he believed that it was thanks to Masato that everything had turned out well. Everyone immediately began to applaud Masadu while he pretended that it was not worth it. The guy himself began to suspect that Nanis was up to something and glanced quickly at the girl to see her reaction to all this. The hunter's face showed only a slight smirk and not a hint of irritation. Masadu began to suspect that his rival was harboring resentment because he had interfered. So now he was going to make her pay for all her insolent actions. Meanwhile, Nanis announced that she would take responsibility for finding out the cause of the dungeon breach and would also hold the guild accountable for the delay in reinforcements. All the hunters immediately calmed down at her cold severity and icy gaze. The girl noted that it seemed that all questions for her had already been exhausted, so she took her leave of her colleagues. At that moment, the conference room door swung open and someone else entered. It was Moore and Aries who were glad that the meeting was not over yet and explained that they had come here on behalf of the International Association with some important information. They reported that due to a recent break-in, the world's only Corrosion Dragon longsword had been stolen. The hunters explained that the incident occurred during transport when the sword was being sent to an exhibition in Japan and asked everyone to actively participate in the search for the weapon. Glass immediately remembered that the convoy guards themselves seemed to have removed the seal from the van when it was attacked by bandits. Aries Hugh immediately reported that this had happened at the request of Hunter Satoru Shinoda from the Taiken Guild and Hunter Haruto Sano from the Japanese Hunters Association. Fukuwa Takuo and Nasu were shocked when they learned this shocking detail of the incident. Even Shiroki Masadu did not expect his recent rival to be behind the theft of the longsword. Shinato Makoto was confused when he realized that a member of his organization could be a suspect. Fukuwa Takuo, in turn, noted that there was no hunter named Sano Haruto in the Japanese Association. Nice just gritted her teeth in anger because she was the one who had accepted this guy into her team. Masato immediately noticed his rival's reaction and thought that this was a great chance for revenge. Then he asked Aries if she meant the young man who tied up the Bear King with a web. The hunter said that they had had a minor disagreement on the spot, but he himself was surprised because it seemed that the guy was really a member of the association. In the end, he turned to Ms. Nanis and asked how to understand all this because it seemed that she was acquainted with the suspect. Masadu asked directly if this man could have stolen the long sword of the Corrosion Dragon. Meanwhile, the legendary weapon was in the possession of Kurosaki Takumi, the very same bandit and head of the Dark Guild Blood Tower. The criminal admired this blade because his level would increase by 200 just by holding it in his hands. Now he understood that all the billions spent on organizing this dungeon breakthrough were worth it. Takumi's assistant, who had been listening to all this, couldn't believe that the leader had actually organized the breakthrough. At that moment, the guild leader turned to him and asked him to explain how his subordinate had lost his entire team. The fighter began to tearfully apologize to the boss and explained that some strange guy had followed them who must have already died. Kurosaki Takumi looked at him closely to see if the guy was telling the truth. In the end, he announced that the entire share would now go to the squad commander because the corpses certainly didn't need the money anymore. The bandit immediately pounced on the money and now considered his task finally complete. Suddenly, the guild leader sternly declared that his subordinate had failed the mission after all. With a smirk on his face, Takumi wondered who would sell the world's only legendary sword for 10 billion and began to suspect that the guy had taken on this task to get information about it. The gangster immediately jumped up because he remembered very well what failure meant in their organization. Now, he was not going to treat the boss with such respect because he realized that the boss had been going to kill him from the very beginning. Takumi himself explained that it was nothing personal, but in any case, He didn't need any witnesses, so it was better to deal with everyone who had participated in this operation. A second later, a powerful swing of the blade unleashed incredible energy, and the sturdy wall material crumpled. After that, the bandit himself flew in, unable to survive such a powerful blow. The leader did not stop there, and simply cut the poor guy's body in half. Then the system reported that the durability of the Corrosion Dragon longsword had decreased by 2 points, leaving only 8. Takumi immediately thought that it would be too unfortunate if the legendary weapon broke before they could repair it. At the same time, the unknown entity contacted the main character again and said that it had given the boy a gift. With a cry, Haruto awoke from a dream in which a ghostly hourglass was inexorably counting down the time. The young man also felt the mark on his neck begin to burn and throb, immediately reacting to the presence of its owner. He grabbed the sore spot and now understood that the hourglass had made its move once again. Satoru, who was also in the hospital, was incredibly happy when he saw that Haruto had regained consciousness because he was afraid that he would never wake up again. The young man said that when our hero was wounded, a dazzling pillar of light burst out of the sea. Sakub, who was also lying in the same ward, was surprised when he realized that his partners were at the epicenter of the Rainbow Bridge dungeon breakthrough. Meanwhile, the main character had already found the strength to get out of bed. Satoru enthusiastically recounted all the events of that day, while Haruto clutched his head in pain, which was literally swelling from the energy of his new friend. Then, Sakub told our hero that it was this young man who had saved his life. So, he immediately asked how it happened. It turns out that the young man considered it his duty and alerted both Taiken and the association. So they had a hard time. But in the end, their people found the missing Haruto on the coast. Hearing this, the main character couldn't understand how some underground controller had managed to get the guild and the association to take action. Finally, the guy realized that the head of Taiken was Shinoda Makoto, and his comrade's name was Shinoda Satoru, which could hardly be a coincidence. In the end, Saruto thought it was complete nonsense because such things only happen in TV series. Meanwhile, the events moved to the office of the chairman of the Hunters Association where a small meeting was taking place. Nannies reported that the Hunter Sono had indeed been killed as the escorts had seen his death with their own eyes. Moore noticed that the commander did not seem surprised by this fact at all and immediately thought that this was a strange reaction. The girl calmly placed her cup on the table and explained that the work of a hunter always carries risks. These words upset the young man because he could not take someone's death so lightly. Then Fukuwa Takuo, who had already seen the official letter from the foreign hunters requesting cooperation, spoke up and said that they would do everything possible to help in the search for the legendary sword. Hearing this, Ares immediately asked them to provide several high-level hunters because they already knew where the sword was. The chairman of the association had of course expected something like this, but he was surprised that they had already determined its location, thinking that they had used magic to track it down. The long sword of the Corrosion Dragon was not a personal item, but it was engraved with runes that allowed the owner's level to be assessed. So, Ari sensed this engraving and tracked it. Now, Nannis understood why they had allowed Mr. Sano to use the legendary weapon because no one had previously mentioned the special mark. The girl also said that before the weapon was stolen, it had a durability of about 10, but someone had used it, so there was a possibility that the blade would disappear very soon. It turns out that Nannis knew that in the past, the same clue had been used to find Arisa's mother, who had disappeared during an incident 15 years ago. The hunters were surprised when they realized that their Japanese colleague knew about this. The girl explained that they weren't newbies here either, so the association had long known that the stolen longsword was a relic of the hunter's mother. At that moment, Arisa immediately jumped up from her seat. While Moore watched his partner in surprise, she again asked Miss Nanny to help her return her mother's relic. After meeting with these two, Nanny still couldn't shake the feeling that Ares and Moore were hiding something. The story with Mr. Sono also aroused her suspicion because she did not believe that this guy would die in the incident. As the girl walked down the empty corridor, someone quickly caught up with her and called out to her. It was Shinoda Makoto who noticed that his colleague looked upset. So, he thought that something had happened or that she had been overloaded with work again. Nanny's replied that she was fine and asked if the man had any business with her. It turned out that the guild leader wanted to ask her to return to Taiken. Sighing heavily, Nannis reminded him that there had been an increase in dungeons lately. She did not agree at all that at a time like this, large guilds like Taiken, instead of clearing them out, were playing capitalism and all they cared about was damn profits and stock prices on the stock exchange. The girl also emphasized that Makoto would be in big trouble if it turned out that the breach was the result of their guild's negligence. It turned out that the man was also the father of Nannis, who had no intention of leaving all the affairs of the association that required her attention. Then the guild leader laughed, trying to defuse the tense situation and explained that he had once again said too much, even though he wanted to talk about something else entirely. Makoto suggested that his daughter visit the Central Hunter Hospital before she left. Evening came, and the girl decided to listen to her father, so she went to that place. Meanwhile, the main character, who happened to be there, climbed onto the roof and examined his stats after managing to absorb all the buffs of the longsword. Haruto thought that this might be for the best, because it was unclear how he would go hunting with a legendary weapon that would surely attract a lot of attention. Then he decided to take a closer look at the rage skill, which doubled all stats and a user's level for 1 minute if their health dropped to a minimum. The main character remembered that just before his death, he had turned into a berserker, which caused him terrible pain. But it was thanks to this that he managed to tear apart Ki, whose level exceeded 400. He also managed to absorb Ki's shockwave into his copy skill.